He needed a wife by Friday to keep the grant. She needed a roof by Friday to survive. The land agent arrived in Table Rock on a Monday and told Dougal Fenn that the territorial office had reviewed his homestead claim and found it deficient. The deficiency was not the land, which Dougal had improved steadily for 3 years, breaking sod, building a cabin, digging a well, running fence. The deficiency was Dougal himself. He was unmarried, and the revised territorial guidelines, issued in April and now being enforced with the bureaucratic enthusiasm of men who had never plowed a furrow, required that homestead claims of more than 160 acres be held by a married person or a head of household. "You have until Friday," the agent said, a thin man in a town suit who looked at Dougal's cabin and his plowed fields and his tight fences with the impartial assessment of someone who measured the world in forms and signatures. "Demonstrate a married household or the claim reverts to the territory." "I have been on this land for 3 years," Dougal said. "The regulations do not account for duration. They account for status." "Friday, Mr. Fenn." Dougal stood on his porch and watched the agent's buggy disappear down the road and felt the particular vertigo of a man who has built something solid and discovered that the ground underneath it is made of paper. He was 30, built for the work he did, broad in the shoulders, heavy in the hands, with a face that the Dakota wind had turned the color and texture of saddle leather. He had come to Table Rock from Iowa with a plow and a mule and a conviction that hard work was a contract with the land, and the land had honored the contract. The territory, apparently, had other ideas. He needed a wife by Friday. It was Monday evening. He had 4 days to find a woman willing to marry a homesteader she had never met for the purpose of satisfying a bureaucratic requirement, and the pool of available women in Table Rock, Dakota Territory, consisted of Mrs. Hagan at the boarding house, who was 63, and the widow Prosser, who had turned down 3 proposals in 2 years and was unlikely to accept a 4th from a man she had spoken to exactly once. Susanna Price arrived in Table Rock on Tuesday. She arrived on the westbound stage, which deposited her at the depot with a trunk she could not carry, and no one to meet her. She was 26, thin in the way that comes from weeks of insufficient food, wearing a dress that had been good 6 months ago, and was now merely decent. She had a wedding ring on her left hand that she had not yet removed, because removing it meant admitting that the marriage it represented was over in a way that was permanent. Her husband, Cyrus Price, had died of cholera in Omaha, 3 weeks into the journey west that was supposed to have ended in a homestead of their own. The cholera had taken him in 2 days, and the boarding house where they had been staying had taken their savings, and the stage company had refunded half the fare for the remaining ticket, which was enough to get Susanna to Table Rock, but not enough to get her anywhere else. She had chosen Table Rock because it was the last stop on the line where the fare would stretch, and because she had no better criteria for choosing anything. She stood at the depot with her trunk and looked at the town, a single street of false-fronted buildings, a church, a livery, a general store, and she understood with the cold clarity of a woman who has run out of options that she needed shelter before nightfall and had no money to buy it. Dougal was at the general store buying flour when he saw her through the window. He saw a woman standing alone at the depot with a trunk and no one to collect her, and he saw the way she held herself, straight-backed, chin up, the posture of a person who is terrified but refuses to look it. He set down the flour and walked to the depot. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked. "No." "Do you have a place to stay?" "Not yet. The boarding house is on the 2nd Street. Mrs. Hagan runs it." "I cannot afford the boarding house." Dougal looked at her. She looked back at him. 2 people with nothing to offer each other except the specific thing the other needed, standing on a depot platform in the Dakota Territory while the wind blew dust against their legs. Something passed between them in that moment. Not attraction, not trust, not anything so defined, but the recognition of 2 people standing at the same edge and looking down at the same drop. She had nothing. He had everything he had built about to be taken away. The mathematics of desperation had brought them to the same point on the same platform, and mathematics, unlike sentiment, did not require explanation. "My name is Dougal Fenn," he said. "I have a homestead 3 miles north of here. I have a cabin with a stove and a spare room, and food enough for two. I also have a problem that you might be able to help with, and in exchange I can offer you a roof and meals and a place to be until you decide what comes next." Susanna looked at him. She had spent 3 weeks learning that the world was not organized for women alone, and she had developed an instinct for evaluating men that was sharper than any she had possessed before Cyrus died. She looked at Dougal Fenn's hands, which were calloused and clean. She looked at his face, which was honest in the way that simple things are honest, without complication, without hidden rooms. She looked at the road behind him, which led to a homestead she had never seen, and then she looked at the depot, which led to nothing. "What is the problem?" she asked. He told her. He told her about the land agent and the revised guidelines, and the Friday deadline, and he told her plainly, without embellishment, without trying to make it sound like anything other than what it was, a man who needed a wife on paper to keep the land he had worked for 3 years. "I am not asking for a real marriage," he said. "I am asking for a name on a certificate. You would have the spare room. I would not bother you. When you have somewhere to go, you can go." Susanna considered this the way a person considers a map, looking for the dangers, the dead ends, the places where the road might give way. She found them all, and weighed them against the alternative, which was the depot, and the dust, and the last few coins in her purse, and the fact that winter was coming. "I will marry you," she said, "on 2 conditions. First, I will earn my keep. I will not be a guest. Second, if at any time I want to leave, I leave. No discussion." Agreed. Then we should find a preacher. They were married on Wednesday afternoon by Reverend Stoll, who performed the ceremony with the speed and discretion of a man who had seen odder arrangements and had learned not to ask questions that the answers would only complicate. Susanna wore the dress she had arrived in, and Dougal wore the only clean shirt he owned, and they stood in the church and said the words that made them husband and wife, with the solemnity of 2 people entering a business arrangement, and the quiet gravity of 2 people who understood that words, once spoken, have a weight that outlasts their original purpose. Mrs. Hagan served as witness and provided a plate of sandwiches, which was more celebration than either the bride or groom had expected. The cabin was small, well-built, and stripped of everything that was not functional. Dougal had constructed it the way he constructed everything, solidly, without decoration, with the understanding that a thing's purpose was more important than its appearance. The spare room was a partitioned section of the main room, separated by a wall of rough-hewn planks that did not reach the ceiling. It had a cot, a shelf, and a hook for a coat. Susanna set her trunk at the foot of the cot and hung her coat on the hook and stood in the small space that was hers. "It is not much," Dougal said from the other side of the wall. "It is a room with a door and a roof. It is more than I had yesterday." The land agent came on Friday. He inspected the cabin and the marriage certificate and the 2-person household and wrote something on his form and tipped his hat and left. And the claim was saved, and the paper crisis was over. The real crisis, the crisis of 2 strangers living in a small cabin on the empty prairie, was just beginning. They lived in the small cabin the way 2 magnets placed with like poles facing live, always aware of the other's position, always maintaining distance, always orbiting without touching. Dougal left the cabin before dawn and returned after dark, working the land with a focus that was partly devotion and partly escape. Susanna filled the hours between his departures with work of her own, domestic work that transformed the cabin incrementally, the way water transforms stone, not by force, but by persistence. Susanna kept her word. She earned her keep with a ferocity that startled Dougal, who had lived alone long enough to forget what another person's energy looked like inside a house. She cooked meals that were twice as good as anything he had made for himself, because she had learned to cook in a farmhouse kitchen in Ohio, and she brought to it the same seriousness that Dougal brought to plowing. She cleaned the cabin until the floor showed its grain, and the windows let in light that Dougal had not known they were capable of admitting. She organized the pantry, mended his shirts, and patched the draft around the door with strips of wool and flour paste. Dougal noticed these things the way a man notices the weather changing, not in the individual details but in the cumulative effect. The cabin was warmer. The food was better. The air smelled different. The silence, which had been his constant companion for 3 years, had been replaced by the small sounds of another person. Footsteps, humming, the scrape of a pot, the creak of the rocking chair he had built for no one, and that now had someone in it. He caught himself listening for her footsteps in the morning, the particular rhythm of her movement through the kitchen, quick, light, purposeful. And he realized that the silence he had lived with for 3 years had not been peace. It had been absence, and he had confused the two because he had nothing to compare them to. He began to notice other things. The way Susanna stood at the window in the morning and watched the sun come up over the prairie with an expression he could not read. The way she touched the wedding ring on her left hand, Cyrus's ring, turning it absently while she thought about something far away. The way she said his name, carefully at first, as though testing its weight, and then, with increasing familiarity, the way you say the name of a place that is becoming home. One night in September, a thunderstorm hit the prairie with a violence that shook the cabin walls. Lightning turned the world white, and the thunder came so close behind it that the two sounds merged into one. Susanna sat at the table with her hands flat on the wood and her face pale, and Dougal understood without being told that storms had a meaning for her that they did not have for him, that somewhere in the noise and the violence was the memory of something lost. He sat down across from her and put his hands on the table, not touching hers but close enough that she could feel the warmth. They sat like that through the worst of the storm, 2 pairs of hands on a wooden table in a cabin that shook and held. And when the lightning passed and the thunder moved east, Susanna looked at his hands and then at his face and said, "Thank you for not asking." "You will tell me when you are ready," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will." One evening in October, Dougal came in from the fields and found the cabin empty. He found Susanna behind the house, standing at the edge of the plowed field, looking at the land that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The sky was enormous and orange, and the wind was moving the grass in waves that looked like water. "It is beautiful," she said when she heard him behind her. "It is. Cyrus and I were going to have land like this, our own homestead, our own sky. I am sorry you lost him." Susanna turned and looked at Dougal. The orange light was on her face, and her eyes were bright, and he could see the grief in them. But underneath the grief, there was something else. Not hope exactly, but the space where hope could grow if the conditions were right. "I lost him," she said, "but I found this. I do not know what to do with that." "You do not have to do anything with it. It is just here." She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression changed. A wall coming down, a door opening, the slow, careful movement of a person who has been guarding something precious and has decided to set it down. "Dougal," she said, "I would like to stay. You can stay as long as you want. No, I mean stay, not as a guest, not as a name on a paper, as your wife." Dougal felt something shift in the ground he stood on. Not the land, which was solid, but the foundation of his life, which had been built for one and was being rebuilt for two. He looked at this woman who had arrived on a stage with nothing and had turned his cabin into a home and his silence into something that was not loneliness, but companionship. "I would like that," he said. "You are certain?" "I have never been more certain of anything." She took off Cyrus's ring. She held it in her palm and looked at it. The thin gold band that had meant one life and now marked the border between that life and the next. She put it in her pocket, not to forget it but to carry it differently, and she took Dougal's hand, and they stood at the edge of the field while the sun went down and the prairie turned from orange to purple to dark. The marriage that had started as a signature became the truest thing either of them had ever built. The cabin grew. Dougal added a proper bedroom, and then a porch, and then a root cellar, and Susanna grew with it, filling the spaces with warmth and purpose, and the steady accumulation of a life that was no longer temporary. She planted a garden in the spring, and the garden grew, and the homestead that had been saved by a piece of paper was sustained by something much more durable. The woman who had needed a roof, and the man who had needed a name, discovered that what they had given each other, in desperation, had become what they could not live without. The land held, The marriage held, and the Friday deadline that had brought them together became the date they celebrated every year, because it was the day they had each found what they did not know they were looking for.